Hello and welcome to Projector, and on this episode, Matt Damon is back as Jason Bourne. When Nikki, played by Julia Stiles, hacks into the CIA, she uncovers not only its Black Ops plans, but also a secret in the past of Jason Bourne, played by Matt Damon. She locates Bourne, who has been living off the grid with the guilt of his memories, and brings him back into the fold. He starts working to discover what really happened, bringing him on a collision course with the agency's director, Robert Dewey, played by Tommy Lee Jones, and his secret plans called Iron Hand. The Bourne series is one of the best action franchises of recent years. Adapted very loosely from the Robert Ludlum books of the same name, i.e. just the titles and that's it, the film series became a surprise hit in 2002 with the Bourne identity, managing to overcome quite a troubleshoot by all accounts. There are a lot of disagreements between director Doug Liman and the studio, and it managed to propel Matt Damon into an action star pretty much overnight. Although many people don't think the series found its feet properly until director Paul Greengrass came on board for the two sequels, Supremacy and Ultimatum, and he brought with him a lot of documentary-style techniques. There was a lot of use of handheld cameras and fast cutting, and the especially innovative at the time use of shaky cam in the fight scenes, which has been much imitated by far lesser directors to cover up the fact they have no fight choreography, but in the Bourne films really made you feel like you were a part of those sequences. The last Bourne film that Damon and Greengrass did together was Ultimatum back in 2007, although their last actual collaboration was on Green Zone in 2009, but the series hasn't remained entirely dormant since then. Notably, screenwriter Tony Gilroy tried his hand at an expanded universe with the Bourne Legacy, which featured a new lead character, Jeremy Renner's Aaron Cross. And despite the fact that Jeremy Renner is a solid choice as an action star, it wasn't very much of a Bourne movie, nor was it a good movie in general, unfortunately. It had a rather ridiculous plot and it felt very, very minor. It felt like a footnote. And you can tell how well that was received with Damon and Greengrass because this new movie makes no references to it whatsoever, so if you haven't seen it, don't bother. This movie generally tries to pretend like that didn't happen. There are rumours that they're going to do a continuation with Renner's Cross, but at the moment, I'm not really holding my breath. It's notable that Damon was so reluctant to return to the role for a fourth time. When Ultimatum came out, he was very clear in interviews that he felt that the story had wrapped itself up. But they managed to coax him back because Paul Greengrass got involved, and it feels very much like a reunion movie, a lot of people coming together to try and recapture the old magic. And to some extent, the movie does manage to achieve that. As you watch the film, it does feel like we haven't really missed a step from where we were at the end of Ultimatum. The problem, however, is by the same token, it feels like we're stuck in 2007. And the problems begin with Jason Bourne as a character, because as it turns out, Matt Damon, all the way back in 2007, kind of correctly predicted this, in that although time has passed in the series, and although the character has regained a lot of his memories and his identity, the funny thing about Jason Bourne as a character is that over the course of the films, he's got progressively less interesting. Jason Bourne, he's not really a character anymore. The movie starts off by establishing he feels a lot of guilt for his actions and all the people that he's killed, but the movie doesn't really do a lot with that conflict, and I think it's because there isn't really much for Bourne to do here. It's been documented that Jason Bourne only has 25 lines of dialogue in this movie. Admittedly, that's still more than Superman and Batman v Superman, but he feels especially monosyllabic here. And there are moments in this movie that feel almost unintentionally comic. In how silent of a character Bourne has become, there are moments where he's talking to people on the phone and he doesn't reply to them. He just sort of blankly stares, and it feels awkward. I just feel like they don't really know what to do with the character. It always feels like they didn't know where they were going with this, and that's the pervasive sense that you get throughout the entire movie, is that it feels like we're just kind of going through the motions. I think it's interesting to note that this movie is not written by Tony Gilroy, and I think that's probably because of the Bourne legacy, but also because Damon had very critical comments about the script that Gilroy had in on Ultimatum, which they changed substantially during filming. In this case, the script is attributed to both Paul Greengrass, the director, and his editor. That's right, his editor. And generally I felt throughout the film like they were cherry-picking moments from the previous films and stitching them together to make this new movie. There are a lot of plot beats here that are things that they've done before in the previous films, and all throughout it you keep going, I've seen this bit before, I've seen this bit before, I've seen that bit before. Even the choice of locations in this movie feels very familiar, despite the use of Iceland and Athens in its early stages. The middle act goes to Berlin and London, and those are two locations that we've been to quite a lot in the Bourne series. And especially in the London segment, again, there's a sequence that revolves around a train station. In Ultimatum, it was this very long sequence set inside London Waterloo, which was a fantastically suspenseful sequence. Here there's a meet-up going on outside Paddington Station, not directly in it, but still, it just reminds you of the sequence from the earlier film, like, oh, this is another Bourne film that's set in London that has a sequence revolving around a train station. One of the reasons why it feels so same old is that many of the plot beats are very underdeveloped. Like, for example, this new Black Ops program, again within the CIA, Iron Hand, which is meant to be an extension of Treadstone and Blackbriar. And you never really get a sense of how it works. They never really describe how it's meant to be operating. In fact, they even say at the start of the movie, this hasn't even gone live yet. So where's the tension and where's the threat from it? And in some level, it's connected to this subplot with Riz Ahmed as a tech upstart. He's got an app, and he's in cahoots with Tommy Lee Jones's Dewey. Dewey wants to put a backdoor into the program so the CIA can surveillance on its users. And generally this is to try and make the film feel topical. It's trying to address some of the modern technological concerns of our internet age, of where's the line between protecting people and privacy. But it never really goes into that argument in a whole lot of depth, and it kind of feels like a missed opportunity, especially because the movie makes these token concessions to it being a post-Snowden world, and how things seem to be very kind of tense geopolitically. That in Athens, for example, the big action sequence is all set around a riot. But generally, it doesn't feel like things have really moved on very much from the previous movies. The way the Bourne series has evolved, the story has become increasingly secondary to the action sequences. And don't get me wrong, the action sequences in this movie are fairly solid, they're quite well staged, but they lack that certain something. They feel less memorable in this movie. They feel like the spark isn't quite there, and I'm not entirely sure why that is. I think some of it is because the change in the way the action sequences have been staged. No, most notably the fight sequences. The Bourne series are very well known for having some very brutal hand-to-hand combat scenes. And there's a fairly lengthy action sequence towards the end of this film that serves as its climax, which makes up for the fights over the rest of the film, because it feels like the approach they've taken is that Bourne has really become this very violent character. He's taking out his frustrations in his fighting. When we first meet Bourne, he's in these underground fighting rings, and he's developed the ability so much that he can pretty much just knock out people with almost one punch. The difference with the fight scenes for much of this movie is that it feels like they're very quick. They're not as protracted as they are in the previous installments. It feels very much like 30 seconds and then done. And what that does as a whole is that it gives you this feeling that there isn't very much action in the movie, which is technically false. There's a lot of action beats, and there's a lot of violence in the movie. This movie really pushes the limits of its PG-13 rating. There's a lot of off-camera shootings and stabbings just happening outside of frame, but it just gives you a feeling of, oh, is that it? By contrast, however, it feels like the chase sequences have been massively overextended, because you have a lot of these scenes where people are running around after each other, and these go on for quite some time, and after a certain point it feels like we're panning out the running time. It feels like we're making up for the shortfalls in the story by just dragging out these chase sequences. And don't get me wrong, some of these are quite impressive, especially the demolition derby in Las Vegas, but the issue with this movie is that it goes on too long. And during that sequence in particular, I actually lost focus in the movie for a second. It went on to such a point that I just sort of drifted out of the movie for about a second, and then suddenly dropped back into the action. Oh! Now we're back in the movie again. And the same could be said for the sequence in Athens. This riot sequence goes on for a good 15-20 minutes, and it evolves from this foot chase into a motorcycle chase, and you've got this character of Vincent Cassel chasing after them, and you've got the CIA following after them, and you've got all these rioters in between, and it's a very, very complicated sequence. But at the end of the day, it doesn't really further the story after a certain point. It feels like it's just going on and on and on and on. Funnily enough, the things that I felt worked best in this movie are all the stuff to do with the new characters in the CIA, especially Alicia Vikander and Tommy Lee Jones, and the relationship between the two characters. Jones playing, of course, the director of the CIA, and Vikander is playing the head of their cybersecurity division, who is desperate to try and raise above her station. She really wants to become a field agent. She very much has designs on moving her career upwards, and Jones's character can see that. That gives this very interesting rivalry as he conspires against her to basically try and cut her off at the knees, to try and keep her suppressed in some way. And I quite like Tommy Lee Jones playing the villain. He plays very solid villains, and there's very much this element to the character that he's old school, that he'll do whatever it takes because he feels that he's a patriot, and he'll do whatever he feels is right, even if it's unethical. But again, that's not really a new characterization, because that's exactly what you could describe Brian Cox and Chris Cooper in the first two movies. It just feels like another version of those characters. And I know I'm being quite rough on this movie, because it's not a bad movie per se. Despite all my criticisms, it's perfectly watchable, although it is a bit duller than previous entries simply because of the sheer repetition of plot points. But you have to understand that the previous Bourne films between Damon and Greengrass, they set themselves such a high bar with those that this was always going to feel somewhat like a letdown to some extent. But they don't even come close. And the people that have been waiting for this the most, the people that have been waiting almost a decade to see Damon return to this character, they'll feel like the most let down, because this movie doesn't justify bringing back this character after we'd wrapped up his story, effectively. And that really is the thing about this movie, is that it feels like yet another sequel this year that doesn't justify being revived. It doesn't justify having yet another entry in it, the name recognition and the fact that we're in franchise mania. And it just feels like all parties, they had a good time, they managed to revive some of the old magic, but at the same time, it feels like everyone involved said, oh, that'll do. And in this case, that's just not good enough. Jason Bourne feels like a greatest hits collection of the series, retrying all the same notes without much fresh. A lot of the problems come down to the title character frankly being less interesting. His conflict has been resolved, and discovering his identity has somehow given him less personality. And while Damon is watchable as always, he's now more wrecking ball than character. The new cast members are fine. Tommy Lee Jones and Vincent Cassel make solid villains, while Alicia Vikander is wasted here, but even they can't turn around a script that that's so going through the motions that it barely develops its plot points. The action is frenetic as ever, with a lot more carnage and brutality, but there's not enough memorable here to cover up the thin story. It's better than Legacy, but it's easily the weakest out of Damon's films simply because it feels unnecessary. Coming up soon, I belatedly review Ab Fab and Breaking the Bank, and kids playing pirates must become spies in Swallows and Amazons. But until then, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.